To understand the aesthetic soul of the Bayerische Motoren work, one must first understand the geography that cradled it. Munich is not merely a German city, it is the northern gateway to the Alps, a place where the harsh, jagged granite of the mountains yields to the fertile, rolling plains of the plateau. In the early 20th century, this was a landscape defined by a piercing, luminous quality of light, the kind of stark, high-altitude clarity that exposes every imperfection. It was here, under the vast canopy of a white and blue sky, that an industrial identity began to coalesce, forged not in the smoke-choked sprawl of the Ruhr Valley, but in a region known as much for its romantic conservatism as for its scientific precision. The air here was different, thinner perhaps, charged with the static of the FN wind, and it was into this atmosphere that Gustav Otto and Karl Rapp first projected their ambitions, looking not toward the road, but upward, into the infinite grey void of the clouds. The face of Bavaria in those nascent years, shortly before the Great War, was smeared with oil and grease, centered on the gravel flats of the Oberweissenfeld. This airfield, an expansive stretch of meadow on the outskirts of Munich, served as the crucible for the company's prologue. One must imagine the sensory overload of that era, the smell of castor oil burning in radial engines, the concussive thrum of propellers slicing through the autumn mist, and the frenetic energy of a world rushing toward mechanization. It was here that the initial DNA of the company was written, a philosophy predicated on altitude and reliability. When Rapp Motoren work evolved into BMW in 1917, the primary objective was survival in the thin air of the upper atmosphere. This necessitated a design ethos of absolute functional purity. At 10,000 feet, superfluous ornamentation is not merely wasteful, it is a liability. Thus, the seed of BMW's future minimalism was planted not by an artist, but by the unforgiving physics of flight. It is impossible to speak of this history without addressing the most enduring symbol of the mark, the roundel. For decades, a romantic myth has persisted, propagated by a clever marketing image from 1929, suggesting the logo depicts a spinning white propeller against a blue sky. While poetic, the truth is far more grounded in the socio-political fabric of the time. The emblem is, in fact, a mirror of the Bavarian flag, an inverted heraldry of the Free State. The colors, the azure of the Wittelsbach crest, and the white of the snow-capped peaks were a declaration of provenance. In 1917, displaying the state coat of arms for commercial purposes was illegal, so the designers inverted the order of the colors, creating a geometric abstraction of loyalty. This was the first true face of Bavaria presented to the world, a badge that signified local pride, stamped onto machinery that would soon garner global fear and respect. It was a medallion of identity, asserting that high engineering was now an indigenous product of the South. Following the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, a profound silence fell over the factory halls of Munich. The prohibition of aircraft engine manufacturing threatened to strangle the young company in its crib. It is in this desperate interregnum that we see the true crystallization of the BMW philosophy. The pivot from the air to the ground denied the sky. The engineers, led by the brilliant and pragmatic Max Friz, looked down at the cobblestones. The restriction forced a compression of technology. The obsession with lightweight durability, born from the requirements of fighter planes, was distilled into the motorcycle. The R32, unveiled in 1923, was not simply a vehicle. It was a statement of architectural intent. The Boxer engine, with its cylinders extending into the airflow like wings clipped of their feathers, solved the problem of cooling through geometry rather than complexity. The black lacquer paint and the hand-painted white pinstripes established a visual language of stark, authoritative elegance, tuxedo, amidst a sea of rough-spun tunics. The transition to the automobile in the late 1920s, with the acquisition of the Dixie plant in Eisen, marked the moment the face became literal. The early Dixie models were utilitarian creatures, licensed copies of the British Austin 7, possessing little of the Munich spirit. However, as the 1930s approached, a transformation occurred that would define the brand for the next century. In 1933, the BMW 303 was introduced, and with it, the Nearon, the kidney grille. This was a radical departure from the flat, radiator wall aesthetic of the time. The split intake, angled slightly to cut the wind, gave the car a visage. It looked anthropomorphic, aggressive, yet refined, inhaling the road ahead. This was no longer a carriage without horses. It was a breathing organism. The grille became the heraldic shield of the car, a distinctive feature that allowed one to recognize a BMW from a half-mile away through the fog of the Autobahn. We must also acknowledge the complex shadow cast by the 1930s and 40s. The face of Bavaria during this era was hardened by the machinations of the Third Reich. The pursuit of speed and engineering supremacy became entangled with nationalistic propaganda. The iconic 328 Roadster, a masterpiece of aerodynamics and lightweight construction that dominated the Mille Miglia, was born in a time of darkening political horizons. The design philosophy of form follows function was pushed to its zenith, yet it served a regime that utilized such industrial prowess for devastation. The documentary record shows a duality, the sublime beauty of the machinery contrasting sharply with the brutality of the era. The Munich factories, once cathedrals of innovation, became targets, and eventually, ruins. The face of Bavaria was cracked, buried under the rubble of a war that engineering could sustain but not win. The resurrection in the post-war years reveals the stubbornness inherent in the Bavarian character. In the late 1940s and early 50s, Munich was a skeleton of a city. The company survived by manufacturing pots, pans, and agricultural equipment, a humbling return to the dirt. When automotive production resumed, it was schizophrenic, oscillating between the Baroque Angel, the 500, a car of pre-war voluptuousness that the ravaged market could barely afford, into the asset, a microcar license built to keep the lights on. It was a crisis of identity. The face of the company was blurred, caught between the aristocracy of the past and the desperate austerity of the present. They were on the precipice of bankruptcy, dangerously close to being absorbed by their rivals in a fate that would have erased the independent Bavarian spirit from the automotive map entirely. Salvation arrived not through a miracle, but through a return to the foundational philosophy of the new E-Class in the early 1960s. This was the moment the modern face of BMW was sculpted, chiseled by the hands of designers like Wilhelm Hofmeister. The introduction of the 1500 sedan brought with it the Hofmeister kink, that subtle, forward-slashing curve at the base of the seat. It was a static line that conveyed forward motion, a tension suggesting the car was crouching, ready to spring. The belt lines dropped, the glass houses expanded to let in the light, and the kidney grills, though smaller, became sharper, more focused. This was the synthesis of the aircraft heritage and the motorcycle agility, wrapped in steel. It established the template of the sports sedan vehicle that did not ask to be driven, but demanded it. Ultimately, the face of Bavaria, as expressed through these machines, is a reflection of a specific cultural tension. It is the friction between the relaxed, beer garden conviviality of Munich life and the ruthless, icy perfectionism of its engineers. It is a design language that rejects the flamboyance of the Italians and the pure utilitarianism of the Swedes, settling instead on a dynamic static, an object that looks fast, even when parked. From the spinning altitudes of the early biplanes to the shark-nosed aggressors of the 1970s, the visual history of BMW is the history of a region asserting its relevance through the manipulation of metal and air. It is a story written in the curvature of a fender and the negative space of a grille, a silent, roll-in narrative of a people who looked at the Alps and decided that the best way to honor them was to build machines that could conquer them. To understand the genesis of BMW is to understand the specific, cold, and industrial frequency of Munich in the early 20th century, a period defined not by the gleam of the showroom floor, but by the terrifying exigencies of global conflict. We must transport our minds back to the Oberweissenfeld airfield on the outskirts of Munich, an area that was less a center of luxury and more a desolate canvas of marshland and hangars, shrouded in the grey mists of the Bavarian plateau. It is 1916. Europe is tearing itself apart in the Great War, and the air is thick with the scent of unrefined fuel, castor oil, and the sharp, metallic temps of ozone. Here, amidst the deafening roar of primitive internal combustion and the frantic hammering of aluminum sheets, two struggling entities, Rapp Motorenwerk and Gustav Otto Flugmaschinen Fabrik, were about to merge under the extreme pressures of wartime necessity. This was not a humble beginning born of a romantic garage project. It was a birth forced by the sheer, crushing weight of survival and the demand for altitude. The atmosphere inside the factory walls during those formative years was one of organized chaos and high-stakes engineering. One can imagine the sensory overload, the floor vibrating under the feet of hundreds of laborers, the air hazy with coal dust and metal filings. Karl Rapp, a man of ambition but plagued by mechanical vibrations in his engine designs, had laid a foundation that was cracking under the expectations of the Prussian army. It required the intervention of Franz Josef Popp, an Austrian with a piercing gaze and an intolerance for mediocrity, to steer the ship away from disaster. Popp understood that the philosophy of the company could not merely be about production. It had to be about precision that bordered on the obsessive. In this crucible, the company was rechristened Bayerische Motorenwerk. The name itself was utilitarian, descriptive, and devoid of flair, yet it carried a weight of heavy industry, signaling a shift from the personality-driven workshops of the past to a corporate entity dedicated to the mastery of mechanics. However, the true soul of BMW's design philosophy was not forged in the boardroom, but on the drafting table of Max Friz. Friz was a brilliant, arguably genius engineer who had been marginalized by his previous employers at Daimler. When he arrived in Munich, he brought with him a concept that would define the company's obsession with efficiency: the high-altitude carburetor. At a time when aircraft engines choked and sputtered in the thin air above 3,000 meters, Friz designed the BMW i engine, a liquid-cooled inline-six that thrived where others failed. This is a critical moment in our history, for the inline-six engine layout established here, in the pursuit of aerial dominance, would become the very heart of the brand's identity for a century. The smooth, inherent balance of the inline-six was not an aesthetic choice, but a solution to the violent vibrations that destroyed airframes. Thus, the first tenet of BMW design was written: form is nothing without the absolute perfection of function. Yet, just as the company began to soar, the world collapsed. The armistice of November 1918 and the subsequent Treaty of Versailles brought a silence to the Munich factory that was more deafening than the roar of the engines. The treaty explicitly forbade Germany from manufacturing aircraft engines, the only product BMW knew how to build. The factory floor, once a hive of aeronautical innovation, became a ghost ship. It is difficult to overstate the existential dread that permeated the halls of Oberweissenfeld during this period. To survive, the engineers, men who had designed the most advanced machines in the skies, were humbled. They were forced to turn their lathes and casting molds to the production of railway brakes, pots, pans, and agricultural equipment. This was the humble beginning in its truest, most visceral sense, a period of humiliation, where the soaring eagle was forced to scratch at the earth for sustenance. But a philosophy of excellence does not vanish simply because the application changes. It merely, in the early 1920s, as the restrictions of the treaty began to shift, the company looked toward personal mobility, specifically the motorcycle. The result was the 1923 BMW R32, a machine that can be considered the Rosetta Stone of BMW design. Before the R32, motorcycles were largely bicycle frames with engines strapped into them haphazardly, prone to overheating and mechanical failure. Max Friz, retreating to the solitude of his guest room to escape the noise of the factory politics, sketched a solution that was radically logical. He turned the engine 90 degrees, projecting the cylinders out into the airstream for cooling, and connected the gearbox directly to the engine, driving the rear wheel via a cardan shaft rather than a fragile chain. When the R32 was unveiled at the Berlin Motor Show, it did not look like its competitors. It possessed a monolithic, architectural quality. It was a complete thought, a unified object where the engine was not an accessory to the frame, but the central sculpture around which the frame was wrapped. This was the birth of the design follows function ethos that would permeate the brand for decades. The R32 was painted black with hand-drawn white pinstripes, livery of stark, serious elegance. It lacked the ornamental brass and frivolous decoration of the Victorian era. It was a machine of the modernist age, anticipating the Bauhaus movement that was gaining traction just a few hours north in Wien. The visual language was one of restraint, communicating reliability and engineering prowess through the exposure of its mechanical heart. We must also pause to consider the emblem that adorned this new machine, the now iconic round. While mythology often romanticizes it as a spinning propeller blade cutting through the blue sky, the historical truth is grounded in regional pride. The blue and white quarters were a mirror of the Bavarian state colors, inverted to circumvent trademark laws banning the use of state coats of arms in commercial logos. Yet, the myth persists because it feels true. It aligns with the company's heritage of the air. When a rider mounted the R32, They were not merely sitting on a bicycle with a motor. They were piloting a piece of precision engineering that carried the DNA of a fighter plane. The tactile experience, the solid click of the transmission, the low center of gravity, the absence of chain grease spoke to a customer who valued substance over style. As we look back at this foundational era, spanning from the fog-laden airfield of 1916 to the polished black steel of the 1923 R32, we see the crystallization of a specific character. BMW did not begin as a manufacturer of status symbols. It began as a survivalist in a hostile geopolitical environment, an entity that valued the high-altitude capabilities of an engine over the comfort of a seat. The humble beginning was a trial by fire that burned away everything unnecessary, leaving behind a core philosophy that was cold, rational, and profoundly effective. They had descended from the clouds to the asphalt, but they brought the standards of the sky down with them, forever altering the expectations of what a vehicle could and should be. To understand the genesis of aerodynamic elegance within the BMW archives, one must first embrace the invisible medium through which these machines were destined to travel. Before the clay was modeled or the aluminum sheets were beaten into submission by wooden mallets, there was the air itself, a formidable, invisible wall that stood in judgment of every automotive silhouette. In the early 20th century, the automobile was largely conceived as a carriage without horses, a box designed to shelter occupants from the elements, pushing bluntly against the atmosphere. However, as the frantic pursuit of speed gripped the European imagination in the late 1930s, a philosophical shift occurred in Munich. The engineers began to view the atmosphere not merely as an obstacle to be bludgeoned by horsepower, but as a fluid substance to be negotiated with, a partner in the dance of velocity. It was here, in the hushed corridors of pre-war design studios, that the concept of the streamline ceased to be a mere aesthetic trend and transformed into a rigorous scientific discipline, marrying the cold hard data of drag coefficients with the undeniable romance of curvature. The socio-political backdrop of this era cannot be ignored, for it provided the crucible in which these designs were forged. Germany in the late 1930s was a nation obsessed with the projection of technological superiority, manifesting most visibly in the construction of the Autobahn network, the white ribbons of concrete that promised limitless speed, while other manufacturers chased this mandate through sheer displacement and monstrous engines. BMW adopted a doctrine of efficiency and lightness. The political clouds gathering over Europe created a paradoxical environment. Resources were becoming scrutinized, yet the demand for performance was at an all-time high. This tension birthed a new kind of ingenuity. It was no longer enough to simply add cylinders. One had to cheat the wind. The resulting philosophy was less about the brutal conquest of nature and more about a harmonious integration with physics, a mindset that would come to define the Bavarian ethos for decades to come. Enter the BMW 300, and more specifically, the special streamlined bodies constructed for competition. Consider the Sanar Bar Touring Coupe, a machine that seems to have been poured from liquid silver rather than assembled from solid parts. Its existence owes much to the collaboration with the Milanese coach builder Carrozzeria Touring and their superleggera construction method Superlight. But beyond the weight savings, it was the shape that whispered to the future. The fenders were no longer separate appendages tacked onto the fuselage. They were integrated, flowing organic forms that guided the turbulent air over the wheels and along the flanks of the car. Standing before it today, even in the stillness of a museum, the car looks fast, as if the wind has permanently etched its path into the metal. The headlights, previously protruding like watchful eyes, were now swept back into the bodywork, eliminating the parasitic drag that had plagued earlier designs. This was functionalism, certainly, but it was functionalism delivered with a breathtaking, painterly grace. The apotheosis of this early aerodynamic era occurred at the 1940 Mille Miglia. Imagine the sensory overload of that event: the dusty, sun-baked Italian roads, the smell of unburnt fuel and heated oil, and the roar of engines echoing off the village walls of Brescia. In this theater of endurance, the 328 Touring Coupe did not just compete, it dominated. Driven by Huschke von Hanstein and Walter Babuma, the car sliced through the Italian peninsula with an average speed of over 100 miles per hour. It was a victory of shape over brute force. While competitors wrestled with instability at high speeds, the BMW sat planted, the aerodynamics pressing it gently into the tarmac. This victory validated a crucial hypothesis: that a car could be beautiful, efficient, and victorious simultaneously. The Buglefort Roadster, another variant from this era, named for the sharp trouser crease running along its fenders, further exemplified this. It proved that the wind tunnel could act as a sculptor's studio, where the desire for low drag produced lines of haunting elegance. Following the devastation of the Second World War, the recovery of this aesthetic timeline was slow, halting, and deeply introspective. The 1950s brought the Baroque Angel, the 501, which, while curvaceous, looked back toward a heavier, more ornamental past. However, the true spiritual successor to the pre-war streamliners emerged in the form of the 507. Here, under the pen of Albrecht von Gortz, the lessons of aerodynamics were softened into a language of pure leisure and luxury. The 507 was not a race car designed to sever the air. It was a grand tourer designed to glide through it. The side vents, complete with a BMW roundel, were not merely decorative flourishes, but functional extractors for engine heat, a nod to the marriage of utility and beauty. The car sat low, wide, and impossibly sleek, capturing the optimism of the economic miracle. Or were shafts wander, it possessed a shark-like nose that leaned forward, eager to engage with the road, a design cue that suggested motion, even when the vehicle was at rest. As the narrative moved into the 1960s and the establishment of the new E-Class, the approach to aerodynamics shifted from the organic, flowing lines of the 328 and 507 to a more architectural, structured efficiency. This was the era of the wind tunnel becoming a standard tool of the trade, stripping away the excess to reveal the three-box design that would dominate the modern era. Yet, even in this transition to sharper edges and taller greenhouses, the elegance remained. It was found in the Hofmeister kink, the forward bend at the base of the seat. While often cited as a stylistic signature, it structurally strengthened the roofline and visually propelled the car's center of gravity forward. It was a subtle manipulation of line that told the observer this was a rear-wheel drive machine, built for driving pleasure. The air was now being directed with mathematical precision, guided over flat decks and sharp trunk lids to minimize lift, a far cry from the teardrop shapes of the 30s, but no less dedicated to the science of flow. By the time we arrive at the monumental 3.0 CSL in the 1970s, the Batmobile, the definition of aerodynamic elegance, had evolved into something undeniably aggressive. Here, the elegance was found in the brutal honesty of the engineering. The massive rear wing, the front air dam, the fins running along the fenders. These were not styling exercises, but desperate necessities for high-speed stability on the track. The engineers were no longer just trying to slip through the air. They were manipulating it to generate downforce, to glue the car to the asphalt. There is a profound beauty in this utility. A form follows function ethos taken to its logical extreme. The CSL did not hide its purpose. It wore its aerodynamic aids like armor. It was a visual representation of the air's power, a machine that acknowledged the violence of velocity and countered it with rigid, unwavering geometry. In retrospect, the history of BMW's aerodynamic design is not merely a chronicle of reducing drag coefficients. It is a story of how a mechanical object interacts with the natural world, from the hand-beaten aluminum curves of the 1930s that sought to mimic the drop of water, to the architectural precision of the 1960s, and finally, to the winged warriors of the 1970s. The common thread is a respect for the invisible. It is a quiet, scholarly acknowledgement that to move forward, one must understand the resistance that lies ahead. This is the essence of aerodynamic elegance, the peaceful resolution of the conflict between a moving object and the air that surrounds it, resulting in a silhouette that feels inevitable, as if the wind itself had a hand in the drawing. To understand the arrival of the BMW 501 and its more powerful sibling the 502, one must first immerse themselves in the grey, particulate atmosphere of the early 1950s. Europe was not merely rebuilding, it was waking from a coma, wiping the masonry dust from its eyes and attempting to remember what elegance felt like. In Munich, the air was thick with the scent of wet mortar and unrefined coal, a sensory reminder of the laborious reconstruction of Bavaria. It was here, amidst the skeletal remains of heavy industry, that a decision was made, decision that seemed, to the pragmatic observer, entirely divorced from reality. BMW, a company that had lost its Eisenach automobile factory to the Soviets and was surviving by manufacturing pots, pans, and agricultural equipment, decided to build a luxury car. This was not a modest vehicle for the proletariat, but a statement of opulence that defied the austerity of the era. The year was 1951, and the stage was the Frankfurt Motor Show, the first international exhibition of its kind in Germany since the war. The tension in the hall was palpable, a mixture of national anxiety and desperate hope. When the silk sheet was pulled back to reveal the 501, the audience did not see a machine of the future, but rather a romanticized dream of the past. The design was resplendent, a curvaceous rejection of the utilitarian ponton styling that was beginning to dominate the automotive world. Its fenders were not flush with the body, but flowed like liquid sculptures, separate and distinct. Harkening back to the pre-war grandeur of the 1930s, it was this soft, billowing aesthetic that earned it the moniker Barockengel. The Baroque angel, it stood there, shimmering under the incandescent lights, an anachronism of aluminum and steel that promised a return to dignity. However, the beauty of the Baroque angel masked a turbulent and painful gestation. The engineering team in Munich was working with their backs against a wall of existential dread. Having lost their tooling and their technical archives to the Soviet zone, they were forced to innovate from zero. The chassis was a robust perimeter frame, heavy and rigid, designed to isolate the occupants from the shattered roads of post-war Germany. The suspension was a marvel of torsion bars, providing a ride quality that was famously described by motoring journalists of the time as gliding on a cloud of Bavarian air. This was the angel aspect of the nickname, a sense of protective, celestial detachment from the harsh, potholed reality of the Reconstruction era. Inside, the cabin was a sanctuary of mohair and wood, a quiet cocoon where the captains of industry could plot the Wirtschafts, the economic miracle that was just beginning to take root. Yet, the 501 was born with a heart that was too small for its heavy body. The pre-war six-cylinder engine struggled to propel the massive sculpture with any real urgency, a flaw that drew sharp criticism from a press hungry for German engineering dominance. It wasn't until the introduction of the 502 that the Baroque angel truly found its wings. This iteration introduced Germany's first post-war light-alloy V8 engine, a piece of technical wizardry that was as light as it was powerful. The V8 transformed the car from a sluggish beauty into a high-speed Autobahn cruiser, capable of speeds that few other sedans could match. The sound of that engine, a cultured, burbling resonance, signaled to the world that BMW had not only survived the war, but had retained its engineering soul. Culturally, the Baroque angel occupied a strange and solitary peak in the automotive landscape. It was priced at a level that was astronomical for the average German citizen, costing roughly 4 times the annual salary of a skilled laborer. To drive a 501 or 502 was to declare oneself part of the elite, but specifically, an elite that valued tradition over the flashing modernism of the American influence. It was the car of the bank director, the high-ranking politician, and the conservative industrialist. It projected an image of stability and permanence, a psychological anchor in a world that had been fluid and chaotic for over a decade. It was less a car and more a rolling monument to the idea that the old ways, the high standards of German craftsmanship, had survived the inferno, despite its artistic triumph. The Baroque angel was a financial catastrophe. The complexity of its bodywork was its Achilles heel. The sensual curves and flowing fenders required extensive hand finishing, a labor-intensive process that bled the company's coffers dry. BMW lost roughly 4,000 Deutschmarks on every single luxury sedan that rolled out of the factory gates. It was a tragic irony. The car that re-established BMW's reputation for excellence was simultaneously driving the company toward bankruptcy. The board meetings of the mid-1950s were filled with panic and acrimony, as the beauty of their flagship product clashed violently with the ugliness of their balance sheet. The angel was dragging them down, not lifting them up. This tension between art and commerce came to a head in the late 1950s, leading to the near sale of BMW to its rival, Daimler. It is a chilling thought for the modern enthusiast to realize that the company came within hours of ceasing to exist as an independent entity, largely because they refused to compromise on the build quality of this singular, unprofitable car. The 501 and 502 were kept in production not because they made money, but because they maintained the prestige necessary to sell the brand. They were the lost leaders of a desperate aristocracy, holding the line until the new class of vehicles could arrive to save the company in the next decade. As we look back at the silhouette of the Baroque angel today, resting on the manicured lawns of a Concorde, We must see it as more than a collector's item. It is an artifact of struggle. Its heavy chrome bumpers reflect a time when steel was scarce. Its thick leather seats hold the memory of a generation that sought comfort after years of hardship. The design, with its sweeping lines and stubborn refusal to adopt the modern slab-sided look, stands as a testament to Bavarian stubbornness. It was a refusal to conform, a declaration that even in the midst of ruins, there was space for excess, for beauty, and for the impractical pursuit of perfection. In the quiet hum of its V8 engine, one can hear the fading echo of that pivotal moment in history. The Baroque Angel was not the car BMW needed for its wallet, but it was the car BMW needed for its soul. It bridged the gap between the ashes of the 1940s and the technological dominance of the 1970s. It was a glorious, beautiful mistake that saved the spirit of the marque, even as it nearly destroyed its body. It remains a floating, soft-sprung ghost of an era where the definition of luxury was inextricably linked to the weight of history. The year is 1955, and the world stands at a peculiar, shimmering intersection of memory and aspiration. In the grand ballrooms of the Waldorf Astoria in New York, the air is thick with cigarette smoke, the clinking of crystal, and the murmur of post-war affluence. Yet, across the Atlantic, in the heavy, industrial heart of Munich, the atmosphere is markedly different. Germany is in the midst of the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, attempting to claw its way out of the rubble and moral shadow of the preceding decade. It is here, within this tension between the austerity of reconstruction and the intoxicating promise of the jet age, that Bayerische Motorenwerk finds itself in a precarious existential crisis. The company is surviving on the sales of the microscopic, bubble-like, Isetta and robust motorcycles, while their luxury sedans, the heavy and bulbous Baroque Angels, fail to capture the imagination of the lucrative American market. The boardroom is anxious. The ledger sheets are bleeding red ink. What is needed is not merely a machine, but a statement, a declaration of elegance that can bridge the chasm between Bavarian engineering and the glittering boulevards of Hollywood. Into this void steps Max Hoffmann, the legendary, persuasive Austrian-born importer based in New York, a man with an uncanny ability to dictate the desires of the American elite to European manufacturers. He demands a roadster, not a racer, strictly speaking, but a grand tourer that can sit comfortably between the unattainable Mercedes 300 SL and the British triumphs of the day. But BMW lacks a design language for such a vehicle. The solution arrives in the form of Count Albrecht von Gortz, an aristocratic German expatriate industrial designer living in the United States. It is a serendipitous, almost fateful pairing. Gortz, unburdened by the heavy pre-war design dogma that still shackled many in Munich, envisions a form that is fluid, athletic, and startlingly modern. He sketches a silhouette that suggests motion even when the object is at rest, a design that does not shout for attention but commands it through a quiet, undeniable poise. When the cover is finally pulled back to reveal the BMW 5.7, the silence that follows is not one of confusion, but of collective awe. It is, by almost every critical metric of the era and those since, the most beautiful car ever to wear the wrap. The visual impact begins at the front, where the traditional vertical kidney grilles, the hallmark of the brand since the 1930s, have been radically reinterpreted. Gortz stretches them horizontally, creating a shark-like, predatory intake that seems to inhale the horizon. It is a visage of pure confidence. The headlights are set into the fenders with a sculptural grace, flowing backward into a bonnet that seems to stretch on for miles, housing the beating heart of the machine. This is not the brutalist utility of a war machine. It is the sculpture of a new renaissance. Constructed from hand-beaten aluminum, move the eye along the flank of the 507, and one witnesses a masterclass in proportion. The waistline undulates like a wave on a calm sea, dipping just behind the door handle before rising over the muscular rear haunches. There is a sensuality here that was largely absent from Germanic design of the period, a touch of Italian flair disciplined by Teutonic precision. The famous side gills, adorned with the BMW Randell, serve as both a functional vent and an artistic signature, breaking the visual mass of the fender with a splash of chrome that catches the sunlight. It is a car designed for the open air, for the coastal highways of California and the twisting alpine passes of Bavaria. With the roof down, the line from the windshield to the rear deck is unbroken, a seamless integration of interior and exterior, inviting the driver to become part of the landscape rather than merely a traveler passing through it. The interior of the 507 reflects a philosophy of intimate luxury. It is not laden with the superfluous gadgetry that would come to define later decades. Instead, it offers a tactile analog honesty. The dashboard is a clean sweep of body-color metal, punctuated by clear, legible gauges that communicate the engine's vitals without ambiguity. The steering wheel, often finished in ivory-colored plastic with 4 thin spokes, feels delicate in the hands, belying the strength of the car's character. The scent of high-grade leather, the click of mechanical switches, and the firm, mechanical throw of the gear lever create a sensory environment that is deeply human. It is a cockpit that requires engagement, demanding that the driver be present in the moment, conducting the symphony of the machine. Underneath that endless hood lies the first light-alloy V8 engine produced in series, a 3.2-liter marvel pushing out 150 horsepower. In the context of 1956, this was significant power. But the 507 was never about brute force. It was about the delivery of that power, the burble at idle rising to a sophisticated, mechanical roar at speed. The suspension, while derived from the sardines, was tuned for a ride that was firm yet compliant, capable of devouring continents with grace. To drive the 507 is to dance with it. It is not a car that fights the road, but one that flows over it, the aluminum bodywork feeling lighter and more agile than its competitors. It represents the sheer driving pleasure tagline, decades before the marketing department ever penned the phrase. Yet, there is a tragedy woven into the beauty of the 507, a melancholy that only enhances its legend. It was a financial disaster. The complexity of the hand-built aluminum body meant that production costs spiraled out of control. No two 507s were exactly alike. The variability in the panel beating meant that a hardtop fitted to one car might not fit another. BMW lost money on every single unit sold. Intended to sell by the thousands, only 252 examples were ever produced between 1956 and 1959. It was a car so perfect in its ambition that it was unsustainable in reality. It brought the company to the very brink of bankruptcy, a beautiful Icarus that flew too close to the sun of perfection, nearly burning the wings off the entire enterprise. However, its cultural impact was inverse to its sales figures. It became the darling of the jet set, the ultimate accessory for the arbiters of cool. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, bought one while stationed in Germany, famously painting it red because female admirers kept leaving messages in lipstick on its original white paintwork. It appeared in films, in magazines, and in the driveways of aristocracy. The 507 did not save BMW's bank account, but it saved BMW's soul. It proved that this manufacturer of bubble cars and motorcycles was capable of producing high art. It established a lineage of roadsters from the Z1 to the Z8 that would continuously reference this moment of absolute aesthetic clarity. In the long, turbulent history of automotive design, few objects transcend their function to become true cultural artifacts. The BMW 507 is one such object. It stands as a testament to a specific moment in time when the desire for beauty outweighed the demands of the accountant. When a German count and an Austrian importer dreamed a vehicle into existence that looked like nothing else on earth. To look at a 507 today, sitting quietly in a museum or moving gracefully across a concours lawn, is to witness the physical embodiment of optimism. It is the most beautiful car not simply because of the curvature of its fenders or the ratio of its wheelbase, but because it represents the triumph of the artistic spirit over the rigid constraints of industrial necessity. To understand the genesis of the new E-Class, one must first navigate the chilling mists of the late 1950s, standing upon the precipice of a corporate funeral. Munich in the winter of 1959 was a city rebuilt from rubble. Yet the Bayerische Motorenwerk was a crumbling edifice of a different sort, teetering on the edge of financial oblivion. The company's portfolio was a schizophrenic dichotomy, torn between the prohibitive opulence of the hand-built Baroque Angels, the 501 and 503, sedans that cost a fortune to produce and sold in negligible numbers under tiny, egg-shaped, E-setter bubble cars, licensed from Italy to keep the factory lights flickering. There was no middle ground, no substance for the burgeoning West German middle class to grasp. The ledger books bled red ink, and the board of directors, resigned to their fate, had prepared the surrender papers. The predator circling the gates was none other than ready to swallow their Bavarian rival and relegate the proud, blue and white roundel to the dustbin of history. It was in the smoke-filled, tumultuous atmosphere of the annual general meeting on December 9, 1959, that the trajectory of automotive history was violently wrenched from its predicted path. Small shareholders, the coal dealers and shopkeepers of Munich, revolted against the board's recommendation to sell. In this chaos, the industrialist Herbert Quandt saw not a corpse, but a sleeping giant. Against the advice of his bankers, who saw only risk, Quandt increased his stake to 50%, securing the company's independence. But capital alone does not build cars. It only buys time. What BMW needed was an identity. They needed a vehicle that did not yet exist in the German marketplace, a compact, high-performance saloon that bridged the chasm between the economy car and the luxury limousine. This was the mandate for the new class. It was to be a clean break, a tabula rasa, a shedding of the pre-war skin that still clung to the company's aesthetic. The task of visualizing this salvation fell to a team led by Wilhelm Hofmeister, a man whose name would become irrevocably etched into the lexicon of car design. The development phase, codenamed Project 115, was a study in disciplined urgency. The engineers and designers were working not just for a salary, but for the survival of the badge. As the clay models began to take shape in the styling studios, a new philosophy emerged, one of functional elegance and kinetic potential. Gone were the sweeping pontoon fenders and the heavy chrome ornamentation of the 1950s. In their place came the three-box design, a clearly defined engine bay, a spacious passenger cabin, and a distinct luggage compartment. It was a silhouette of rationalism, reflecting the modernist architecture rising across the Federal Republic, a shape that whispered of efficiency and velocity rather than aristocratic pomp. Central to this new design language was the greenhouse, the glass area of the cabin. The 1500, the first of the new E-Class, possessed an airy, panoramic visibility that was revolutionary for its time. The waistline was low and flat, running like a horizon line from the headlights to the taillights, encircled by a strip of chrome that acted as a datum line for the eye. But it was at the C-pillar, the structural support behind the rear doors, that Hofmeister applied his He introduced a subtle, forward-slashing bend at the base of the window frame. This geometric detail, later immortalized as the Hofmeister kink, was not merely a decorative flourish. It was a subconscious signal, a visual cue suggesting that the car was pushing forward, even when standing still. It widened the pillar base to strengthen the roof support, but aesthetically, it drew the eye down toward the rear wheel, emphasizing that this machine was rear-wheel drive, that the power, the impetus, came from behind. When the BMW 1500 was finally unveiled at the Frankfurt Motor Show in 1961, the reaction was nothing short of a cultural phenomenon. The air inside the exhibition hall was thick with the scent of unburned hydrocarbons and expensive cologne, a sensory mixture of industry and affluence. As the sheets were pulled back, the public did not just see a car, they saw a reflection of their own aspirations. This was the era of the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. A new generation of doctors, architects, and middle managers had emerged, and they rejected the chauffeur-driven stiffness of the past. They wanted to drive themselves. They wanted engagement. The 1500, with its forward-canting shark-nosed grille and its eager, wide-eyed headlamps, looked aggressive yet sophisticated. It promised a driving experience that was athletic, a term rarely applied to family sedans of the era. Under the hood lay the heart of the revolution. The M10 engine, designed by the legendary Baron Alex von Falkenhausen. It was a masterpiece of over-engineering, a four-cylinder unit that was initially planned for 1.5 liters but possessed a block strong enough to handle Formula One levels of boost decades later. This engineering integrity bled through the sheet metal. When one looked at the new E-Class, the exterior design was an honest wrapper for the mechanical excellence beneath. The short front overhangs, the wheels pushed out to the corners, the upright stance, all communicated stability and agility. It was the birth of the sports sedan archetype, a concept that BMW would polish and perfect for the next 60 years. The design did not scream for attention with tail fins or two-tone paint. It commanded respect through proportion and purpose. The impact of the new E-Class extended far beyond the balance sheets. It fundamentally altered the DNA of the brand. Before this moment, BMW was a manufacturer of aircraft engines that happened to make cars. After the 1500, it became the purveyor of the ultimate driving machine, even before the slogan was penned. The interior of the car reinforced this driver-centric philosophy. The dashboard was devoid of unnecessary clutter. The instruments were large and legible, and the steering wheel sat at an angle that invited interaction. It was a cockpit, not a lounge. This shift in perspective, the driver as the protagonist of the journey, was a radical departure from the passive transportation appliances offered by competitors. As we look back through the lens of history, the new E-Class stands as the great divide in BMW's timeline. It was the bridge over the abyss. Every subsequent triumph, the nimble 2002, the definitive 3 Series, the executive 5 Series, can trace its lineage directly back to that desperate, inspired winter in Munich and the pencil lines of Wilhelm Hofmeister. The car proved that design is not merely about beauty, it is about character. The new E-Class did not just save a company, it codified a specific German industrial aesthetic: cold, precise, muscular, and enduring. It was the moment BMW stopped looking backward at the pre-war glory of the 328 and started sprinting toward the horizon, guided by the forward slash of a kink in the rear window pillar. The year is 1961, and the air inside the Frankfurt Motor Show is thick with a specific kind of industrial optimism. A heady cocktail of unburnt hydrocarbons, fresh rubber, and the cologne of a society rapidly ascending from the ashes of the past. Germany is in the throes of the Wirtschaftswende, the economic miracle that has transformed a landscape of rubble into a powerhouse of manufacturing precision. Yet, amidst the cacophony of flashing bulbs and the murmur of thousands of spectators, the Bayerische Motoren Works stands at a precipice. Only 2 years prior, the company had narrowly escaped a takeover by rival Daimler-Benz, salvaged only by the sheer will of small shareholders and the financial injection of Herbert Quandt. The atmosphere surrounding the BMW stand is therefore not merely one of commercial exhibition, but of existential definition. It is here, under the harsh glare of the exhibition lights, that a white sheet is pulled back to reveal the new E-Class, the new class. A vehicle that carries the weight of the company's entire future on its chassis. As the crowd presses into view, the BMW 1500, they are greeted not by the bulbous, baroque curves that defined the luxury automobiles of the 1950s, nor the diminutive bubble car austerity of the Ascent. Instead, they are confronted with a design of startling rationality and crisp, horizontal ambition. The car is a 3-box sedan, an architectural statement of purpose. But the eye of the discerning observer is drawn inevitably to the greenhouse, the glass cabin that sits atop the steel body. It is in the transition between the roof and the body, specifically at the C-pillar, that a subtle, almost subversive geometric rebellion has occurred. This is the debut of the Hofmeister kink, a design element so discreet it might have been missed by the casual onlooker, yet so profound it would become the genetic fingerprint of the brand for decades to come. Wilhelm Hofmeister, the head of the BMW body design department, was not a man given to the flamboyant flourishes of his Italian contemporaries at the design houses of Turin or Milan. He was a pragmatic engineer-stylist, a man who understood that in the German psyche, form could not merely follow function. Form had to elevate function into an aesthetic virtue. The kink, a sharp forward bend at the base of the rear window pillar, was born from a necessity of engineering. It allowed for the strengthening of the C-pillar without increasing its visual mass, keeping the roofline delicate and the cabin airy. However, to view it only as a structural reinforcement is to miss the poetry of the metalwork. Hofmeister had sculpted a line that did not simply end. It returned. It created a visual tension, a loop of kinetic energy that refused to let the eye drift off the back of the car, snapping the gaze back toward the center, toward the driver. There is a deep psychological undercurrent to this specific angle, a subliminal messaging system stamped into steel. In a world where automotive design was increasingly obsessed with the jet-age fins of America or the sensual, drooping tails of the British sports cars, the Hofmeister kink suggested something entirely different: propulsion. By cutting the window line forward, toward the front wheels, the design visually shifted the weight of the car onto its rear axle. It was a static declaration of rear-wheel drive dynamics. Even when the vehicle was parked, the kink made it appear as though the car were a sprinter in the blocks. Muscles tensed, weight over the back legs, ready to launch. It communicated the ethos of the ultimate driving machine long before the marketing slogan was ever penned, whispering to the subconscious of the buyer that this was not a carriage for passive transport, but a machine for active engagement. The context of this design choice must be viewed through the lens of early 1960s modernism. Architecture was shedding its ornamentation for the clean lines of steel and glass. Music was finding new, complex rhythms, and the German identity was being reforged around the concepts of precision and reliability. The kink was the automotive equivalent of a Mies van der Rohe corner detailer refusal to hide the structure. Celebrating the intersection of materials, it was a rejection of the Baroque angel era of BMW. Those heavy, curving sedans that looked like they belonged to a pre-war aristocracy. The Hofmeister kink was sharp, mathematical, and decidedly it was a line drawn in the sand, separating the old world from the new, signaling that BMW was no longer looking back at tradition, but accelerating toward a technocratic future. We must also consider the parallel debut of the BMW 3200 CS, which appeared alongside the 1500 at that same Frankfurt show. This coupe, penned with the assistance of the legendary Italian design house Bertoni and the young Giorgetto, also featured the kink. Historians have long debated the true parentage of the curvewise, it truly Hofmeister's invention, or an Italian flair adopted by the German engineer. The truth likely lies in a symbiotic convergence. Hofmeister, acting as the filter through which all designs had to pass, codified the shape. He recognized that while the Italians used it for elegance, on a BMW, it represented identity. He standardized it, turning a stylish stroke into a corporate dogma. It was an act of branding so subtle that it bypassed the skepticism of the consumer, lodging itself as a feeling of rightness in the silhouette of the car. Imagine running your hand along the cold, painted metal of that 1961 BMW 1500. You trace the flat belt, moving past the rear door handle, and then your hand rises up the pillar. There, at the acute angle where the chrome window surround doubles back on itself, you feel the intent of the designer. It is a sharp pivot. In the soft, diffuse light of the showroom, that kink captures a specific shadow, a triangular wedge of darkness that accentuates the width of the pillar base. It creates a sense of solidity, a guarantee that the roof will not buckle, that the passenger is enclosed in a safety cell of Teutonic rigidity. This was a crucial selling point in an era where safety was beginning to enter the public consciousness. Blending the desire for speed with the need for security, as the years would roll on, this small detail would survive every revolution in automotive fashion. The tail fins would wither and die. The boxy shapes of the 70s would soften into the aerodynamic blobs of the 90s. Engines would move from carbureted purity to digital complexity. Yet, the Hofmeister kink remained. It became the punctuation mark at the end of every BMW sentence. It served as a constant anchor in a sea of changing trends, a reminder of the heritage of the new E-Class. When you look at a modern BMW today, that line is still there, sometimes reinterpreted, sometimes deconstructed, but always present a ghostly echo of Wilhelm Hofmeister, standing on the show floor in 1961, watching as the world realized that a simple bend in a window frame could change the trajectory of an entire company. To understand the genesis of the sports sedan, one must first walk through the chilled, mist-laden streets of Munich in the late 1950s, a city that was simultaneously rebuilding its architectural bones and searching for its industrial soul. The Bayerische Motorenwerk was not the titan of industry we recognize today. Rather, it was a fragile entity teetering on the precipice of oblivion. The company's portfolio was a study in polarization, a confused dichotomy between the prohibitively expensive, Baroque angels, luxury vehicles that whispered of a pre-war aristocracy, and the diminutive Isetta bubble cars, born of necessity for a populace sweeping away the rubble. There was no middle ground, no mechanical bridge for the rising German middle class, who had outgrown austerity but could not yet reach for opulence. In the boardrooms, the air was thick with the smoke of cigars and the heavy silence of impending bankruptcy, a stillness only broken by the looming specter of a takeover by their rival. It was in this crucible of desperation, under the bleak grey skies of a Bavarian winter, that the decision was made not to surrender, but to reinvent. The socio-political atmosphere of West Germany in 1960 was electric, with the energy of the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle that was rapidly transforming a fractured nation into a powerhouse of production and consumption. A new archetype of citizen was emerging from the universities and the reconstructed office blocks. The modern professional. This was a man of technical aptitude and upward mobility, an individual who viewed the act of driving not merely as transportation, but as an expression of personal liberty and competence. The roadways were improving. The Autobahn network was expanding like a nervous system across the continent. And yet, the automotive market offered this new man nothing that truly mirrored his ambition. He was forced to choose between the lethargic, soft-sprung comfort of a family hauler or the impractical, bone-rattling agitation of a British or Italian roadster. The synthesis of these two worlds was considered physically impossible, an engineering oxymoron that no major manufacturer dared to pursue. Entered the project that would save the company, codenamed the New E-Class, the New Class. This was not merely a marketing slogan, it was a declaration of a new industrial philosophy, a complete tabula rasa. When the BMW 1500 was finally unveiled at the Frankfurt Motor Show in September of 1961, the atmosphere inside the exhibition hall was frantic. Thousands of onlookers pressed against the velvet ropes, their breath fogging the glass, their eyes wide with the recognition of something radically different. The car sitting on the turntable did not look like the heavy, pontoon-fended vehicles of the previous decade. It was crisp, tailored, and possessed a tension in its sheet metal that suggested stored kinetic energy. It looked like a predator in a tailored suit, blending the practicality of four doors with the low, aggressive beltline of a coupe. It was the physical manifestation of a company betting its entire existence on a single roll of the dice. The design language introduced with the 1500 was a masterclass in restraint and proportion, orchestrated under the watchful eye of Wilhelm Hofmeister, with significant consultation from the Italian stylist Giovanni Mick. It was here that we first saw the crystallization of the BMW identity. The front fascia was canted forward, a shark nose that seemed to sniff out the apex of the next corner. The kidney grilles were present, but integrated seamlessly into a horizontal architecture that emphasized width and stability. But it was the greenhouse, the glass area, that revolutionized the silhouette. The pillars were thin, allowing for exceptional visibility, creating an airy panoramic experience for the driver. And there, at the base of the C-pillar, was the subtle, forward-angled turn of the window line that would bear the designer's name forever, the Hofmeister kink. This was not just a stylistic flourish. It was a visual subconscious cue, strengthening the look of the rear pillar to suggest that the rear wheels were doing the driving, firmly planting the car's identity as a rear-wheel drive machine. Beneath the bonnet lay the heart of the revolution, the M10 engine designed by the legendary Baron Alex von F. While the American market was obsessed with displacement and the sheer brute force of V8 South, and the British were tinkering with archaic pushrod designs, BMW focused on efficiency and high-revving durability. The 1.5-litre four-cylinder engine was an engineering marvel of overhead cams and hemispherical combustion chambers. It was eager, responsive, and possessed a mechanical song that encouraged the driver to press harder. It was an engine that did not just propel the vehicle, it communicated with the operator. This was a radical departure from the isolationist philosophy of luxury cars of the era, which sought to detach the driver from the mechanical workings. The new E-Class sought to integrate them, creating a symbiotic loop between man and machine. The interior of the 1500 further cemented this new doctrine. For the first time, we saw the beginnings of the driver-centric cockpit. The instrumentation was devoid of the wood-polished drawing room aesthetic of the British marques. Instead, it was functional, clean, and mathematically precise. The speedometer and tachometer were placed directly in the line of sight, uncompromised by frills. The gear lever sat perfectly to hand, inviting interaction. It was a space designed for the serious business of driving, acknowledging that the person behind the wheel was not a chauffeur, but a pilot. The seats were firm, supportive, capable of holding the body in place during spirited cornering, a tacit admission that this family sedan was capable of generating forces that would unseat a passenger in a lesser vehicle. When journalists finally took the 1500 onto the twisting roads of the Bavarian Alps, the verdict was unanimous and transformative. They discovered a vehicle that possessed a dual personality, a schizophrenia of the most delightful variety. It could poodle through village traffic with the docility of a grocery getter, absorbing cobblestones and potholes with a sophisticated independent suspension system. Yet, when the road opened up and the tachometer needle swung past the midpoint, the car tightened. The steering, unassisted and pure, telegraphed the texture of the asphalt directly to the driver's palms. The nose tucked into corners with a neutrality that belied its four-door configuration. It was a revelation. It proved that utility did not require the sacrifice of joy. and that sportiness did not require the sacrifice of comfort. This moment in 1962, when the first production models began rolling out of the Munich plant, marked the true birth of the sports sedan. It was the moment the automotive world realized that a car could be everything to everyone without being a compromise to anyone. The new E-Class saved BMW from bankruptcy. Yes, but more importantly, it established the genetic code for every vehicle that would follow. It created a market segment that had not existed, catering to the dynamic conservative, the professional who demanded excellence in engineering and thrill in motion. As the first 1500s disappeared down the Autobahn, trailing a distinct exhaust note in the crisp German air, they left behind the old world of automotive design and accelerated toward a future where the journey would matter just as much as the destination. To understand the genesis of the shark nose, one must first dismantle the prevailing aesthetic of the late 1950s, a period suffocating under the weight of chrome ornamentation and bulbous biological curves. The automotive world was emerging from a decade of post-war recovery, where design often mimicked the soft, non-threatening optimism of the American jet age. However, in Munich, a different wind was blowing through the drafty halls of the design studios. It was a cold, sharp wind of modernism that sought to strip away the superfluous and replace it with a visual language of kinetic intent. The era of the Baroque angels was ending, and in its place rose a desire for a machine that did not merely transport passengers, but actively cut through the atmosphere. The shark nose was not simply a styling exercise. It was a psychological declaration of aggression and efficiency, a forward-leaning prow that suggested the vehicle was accelerating even when it sat motionless against the curb. The architectural philosophy behind this negative slant, grille where the top edge of the hood protrudes further out than the bumper line was rooted in a fascination with aerodynamics and the predatory grace of nature. When Wilhelm Hofmeister and his team began sketching the silhouettes that would define the new E-Class and the subsequent coupes, they were responding to a Germany that was rediscovering its industrial confidence. The Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, had provided the capital, but the Autobahn provided the theater. On these unrestricted stretches of concrete, the soft, smiling faces of lesser vehicles were swallowed by the slipstream. BMW required a face that commanded the overtaking lane, a visage that, when viewed through the rearview mirror of a slower car, conveyed an immediate and undeniable authority. The forward slant created a shadow over the headlights, a furrowed brow that gave the car a permanent, focused scowl, distinctly separating it from the wide-eyed innocence of its contemporaries. Enter the E9 Coupe, the spiritual zenith of this design ethos. To walk around a 1971 3.0 CS is to witness the perfect tension between elegance and menace. The nose of the vehicle dips low, reaching toward the asphalt with a hunger that is almost palpable. The kidney grills, by this point elongated and narrow, stand like twin sentinels at the center of the prow, framed by the negative space of the black radiator intake. It is a face of absolute purpose. The chrome detailing, sparse compared to the American behemoths of the time, acts only to highlight the horizontal lines, stretching the car visually, making it appear wider and lower. The shark nose on the E9 does not shout. It whispers a threat. It speaks of an engineering pedigree that prioritizes the intake of cool air and the swift displacement of wind, a symbiotic relationship between form and velocity that would come to define the Bavarian mark for decades. This design language was not merely aesthetic, it was deeply entrenched in the socio-political fabric of 1960s and 70s Europe. As the counterculture movements challenged authority and traditional structures, industrial design began to reflect a sharper, more cynical edge. The softness of the post-war reconstruction was replaced by the brutalism of the concrete age and the precision of the computer age. The shark-nose BMW was the automotive equivalent of a tailored suit worn by a man with a hidden dagger. It appealed to a new class of driver, the executive who viewed the drive home not as a leisure activity, but as a competitive sport. The car became an extension of the driver's will, and that forward-thrusting grille was the spear tip of their ambition. It was a design that rejected compromise, creating a silhouette that looked as if it were constantly straining against a leash, eager to devour the horizon. When Paul Bracq arrived in Munich to assume the mantle of design chief, he refined this aggression into something even more sophisticated. With the introduction of the first-generation 6 Series and the formative years of the 5 Series, the shark nose was codified into the brand's DNA Brack understood that the negative rake was crucial for maintaining the BMW face. He integrated the turn signals into the corners, sharpening the leading edge until it looked as though it could slice paper. The transition from the hood to the nose became more angular, more geometric. Under the sodium streetlights of 1970s Berlin or Paris, these cars took on an ethereal quality. The recessed quad headlamps, sheltered beneath the overhanging hood, glowed like the eyes of a deep-sea predator waiting in the gloom. It was a masterclass in using shadow and light to create emotional resonance, turning stamped steel into something that felt alive and dangerous. However, the shark nose was destined to be a victim of its own sharpness. As the 1980s progressed, the harsh realities of pedestrian safety regulations and aerodynamic drag coefficients began to erode the freedom of the designers. The wind tunnel, once the ally of the sleek coupe, now demanded smoother transitions and flush surfaces. The steep, negative angle of the nose was deemed hazardous to pedestrians in the event of a collision, and the quest for fuel efficiency dictated a more rounded, wedge-like profile. Slowly, the proud, jutting chin of the BMW began to recede. The grilles were pushed back, the headlights smoothed over, and the aggressive negative rake was flattened into a more socially responsible, vertical, or rear-leaning orientation. The era of the Predator was giving way to the era of the rational commuter. Yet the legacy of that design element remains burned into the collective memory of the automotive world. It represented a time when a car could be unapologetically assertive, when safety took a back seat to the pure, visceral emotion of speed. The shark nose was a risk. It was a stylistic gamble that alienated those seeking comfort and embraced those seeking power. It turned the BMW from a mere manufacturer of cars into a purveyor of driving machines. Even today, standing before a preserved 3.0 CSL Batmobile, one feels a primal reaction to that face. It is not cute. It is not retro in the kitschy sense. It is a timeless statement of aggression, a piece of industrial sculpture that captures the exact moment when the desire for speed overcame the need for apology. In the quiet, dust-mote-filled air of a museum or the harsh fluorescent light of a private garage, the shark nose still commands respect. It serves as a reminder of a specific frequency of German engineering, stoic, precise, and slightly intimidating. It tells the story of an era where the Autobahn was a proving ground for the nation's soul, and where the car you drove was a direct reflection of your place in the food chain. The shark nose did not ask for permission to overtake. It simply arrived in the rearview mirror, silent and inevitable, a shark in a sea of minnows, demanding the right of way by virtue of its very existence. To understand the emergence of the boxy icon, one must first drift back through the haze of post-war Europe, stepping away from the curvaceous, ornamental excesses that defined the automotive landscape of the 1950s. The world was waking up from a fever dream of tail fins and chrome-laden extravagance, a design language imported largely from American optimism, but which sat uneasily upon the cobblestones of a recovering Germany. As the calendar turned toward the 1960s, a new architectural philosophy began to permeate the cultural ether, one grounded not in the romanticism of the curve, but in the honesty of the straight line. This was the era of the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, where the rebuilding of Munich was governed by the principles of functionalism and rationalism. In this crucible of concrete and steel, BMW found itself at a existential crossroads. Having narrowly escaped acquisition by its rival Daimler-Benz in 1959, to survive, the marque required not merely a new engine, but a new soul of visual language that would reject the Baroque angels of the past and embrace a disciplined, forward-leaning modernity. The manifestation of this survival instinct was the new E-Class, a lineage of vehicles that would crystallize into the definitive O2 series, the spiritual ancestor of the modern sports sedan. The design ethos was a radical departure from the ponton fenders and bulbous roofs that cluttered the auto. Here, under the watchful eye of Wilhelm Hofmeister, the silhouette was distilled into what designers call the three-box configuration. It was a declaration of separate functions, a box for the engine, a box for the passengers, and a box for the luggage. While this sounds rudimentary on paper, in practice, it was a masterclass in proportion. The hood was flat and purposeful, stretching out like a plateau before dropping abruptly into the wind. The passenger compartment was upright, proud, and unapologetically geometric. It was a design that did not try to mimic the wind or the muscle of an animal. Rather, it celebrated the precision of the machine. a distinct Teutonic admission that a car is an object of engineering, constructed by human hands to conquer distance with logic. Central to this new aesthetic was the greenhouse, a term that took on literal significance with the BMW 2002. You look closely at the pillars supporting the roof, the A, B, and C pillars. They are remarkably slender, almost delicate in their appearance. This was a rejection of the claustrophobic, bunker-like cabins of the era. The vast expanse of glass allowed light to flood the interior, creating an atrium of visibility that connected the driver to the rushing world outside. It was a design choice that spoke of transparency and control. The beltline, the critical horizon dividing the metal body from the glass, ran perfectly straight from the headlights to the taillights, often accentuated by a thin strip of chrome trim. This horizontal stroke acted as a visual anchor, lowering the car's center of gravity to the eye and imparting a sense of kinetic potential even when the vehicle was parked in absolute silence. It is impossible to discuss this era without pausing at the C-pillar too. Observe the Hofmeister kink. While it has since become a marketing shell in the context of the 1960s, it was a subtle stroke of genius. That forward bend at the base of the rear window pillar was not mere decoration. It widened the base of the roof structure, visually strengthening the connection between the cabin and the rear bodywork. More importantly, it subconsciously guided the viewer's eye toward the rear wheels, the source of the car's propulsion, in a market dominated by front-wheel drive economy cars that pulled themselves along. The BMW boxy design used its very geometry to whisper a promise of rear-wheel drive dynamics. It suggested that despite the upright, practical stature of the sedan, there was a sports car lurking within the chassis, waiting for the open road. The front fascia of these vehicles introduced a level of aggression that was tempered by elegance, famously dubbed the shark nose. Unlike the flat, wall-like grilles of its contemporaries, the BMW grille slanted forward, creating an overhang that felt predatory and eager. The kidney grilles, narrower and taller than they are today, stood as vertical monoliths in a sea of horizontal lines, flanked by single round headlights that stared ahead with cyclopean intensity. This face did not smile. It did not grimace. It possessed a focused, neutral gaze, a look of intense concentration. It reflected the changing face of Germany itself, serious, highly competent, and obsessed with technical perfection. This was not a car for the flamboyant playboy, but for the architect, the engineer, the doctor. Professionals who appreciated that form must follow function, yet who demanded that the form be beautiful in its austerity. Inside the cabin, the boxy philosophy translated into an ergonomic revolution. Because the exterior walls were vertical rather than tapered, the interior space was maximized, creating a sense of airiness that defied the compact footprint of the chassis. The dashboard was a shelf of clarity, devoid of unnecessary ornamentation. The gauges were circular, legible, and prioritized, staring back at the driver through the thin-rimmed steering wheel. This was the birth of the driver-centric cockpit, a space where the operator was not merely a passenger in the front seat, but an active participant in the mechanical symphony. The upright windshield and the low belt line meant the driver could see the corners of the hood, placing the car on the tarmac with millimeter precision. It was a sensory experience defined by sight lines and spatial awareness, a direct result of the car's boxy architecture. As the 1970s dawned, bringing with them the oil crisis and a global shift toward efficiency, the boxy design of the BMW 02 series proved its timelessness, while the bloated muscle cars of America and the fragile sports cars of Italy struggled to adapt to the new austere reality. The BMW stood resolute. Its shape was compact enough to be sensible, yet its engineering was robust enough to remain desirable. The sheer surfaces, devoid of tumblehome or excessive curvature, meant the car aged with grace, avoiding the trapped dirt and rust that plagued more complex designs. It became an icon of anti-styling, where the absence of trendy flourishes ensured the design never fell out of fashion. It was a tailored suit in a room full of bell-bottom, conservative yet undeniably sharp. In the quiet reflection of history, the boxy icon represents more than just a transitional phase in automotive manufacturing. It represents the moment BMW found its identity. It was the crystallization of a philosophy that viewed the automobile as a coherent system of interactions. The sharp corners, the upright glass, the shark nose, and the Hofmeister kink were not disparate elements, but sentences in a coherent paragraph of design language. They told a story of balance, When one looks at a vintage 2002 today, sitting motionless in the soft light of a museum or a garage, one does not see a dated relic. One sees the blueprint of the modern sports sedan, a testament to the power of geometry, and a reminder that in a world of chaos, there is a profound, enduring beauty in the discipline of a simple, well-proportioned box. To understand the genesis of the quad headlight arrangement, one must first descend into the atmospheric pressures of West Germany in the late 1960s. It was an era defined by a palpable, kinetic energy, a nation in the throes of the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle that had transformed a war-torn landscape into an industrial powerhouse. The Autobahn was no longer merely a transport network. It had become a theater of speed, a concrete ribbon where the hierarchy of the road was determined by horsepower and presence. In the rear-view mirrors of the populace, the distinct visual signatures of overtaking vehicles were becoming a language of their own. It was here, amidst the grey tarmac and the cutting wind of the Bavarian plains, that BMW sought to carve out a new visage, a face that would not merely look upon the road, but stare it down with an intensity that bordered on the predatory dot. The transition from the single, wide-eyed gaze of the new E-Class sedans to the focused, piercing glare of the quad layout was not an accident of styling, but a deliberate philosophical pivot. In the design studios of Munich, the air was thick with the scent of industrial clay and tobacco smoke, a sanctuary where engineers and artists wrestled with the identity of a marque that was rapidly ascending the social ladder. The single headlight, while functional and honest, spoke of utility. It was the look of the post-war reconstruction, efficient and humble. However, the executives and designers, led by the visionary Wilhelm Hofmeister and later refined by the artistic sensibilities of Paul Bracq, understood that, to challenge the hegemony of Mercedes, they needed a visual shorthand for aggression and technical sophistication. They needed a face that communicated a dual nature, the elegance of a saloon and the heart of a sports car. When the BMW E3, known as the New 6, and the stunning E-Joe coupes first broke cover, they presented the world with this new optical architecture. The integration of 4 individual circular lamps into the blackened grille was a masterstroke of contrast. By setting the chrome-ringed luminaires against a matte black void, the designers achieved a floating effect, isolating the eyes of the machine. This was not merely about illumination, it was about anthropomorphism. The car was given a focused, concentrated stare, reminiscent of a predator locking onto its prey. In the context of the Cold War era, where technology was a proxy for national strength, this precision-milled face projected a uniquely German confidence, serious and unmistakably capable. Paul Bracq, a Frenchman who brought a fluid, sculptural elegance to the rigid discipline of German engineering, championed this layout as the definitive look for the brand's expansion. Under his stewardship, the quad headlight became more than a feature. It became a declaration of intent. One must imagine the scene in the design hall in the early 70s, Bracq moving his hands over the clay bucks of the upcoming 5 Series, the E12, insisting that the separation of the high and low beams offered not just better photometric performance, but a wider, more planted stance. The lights pushed toward the corners of the bodywork visually widened the car, grounding it to the asphalt, suggesting a low center of gravity and high-speed stability even when the vehicle was stationary. This evolution coincided with the 1972 Munich Olympics, a moment when the city and, by extension, BMW opened its doors to the global gaze. The futurism of the Olympic Stadium, with its sweeping tensile acrylic glass roofs, found a kindred spirit in the automotive architecture rolling out of the nearby factories. The quad headlights of the first 5 Series reflected this modernism. They were clean, functional, and devoid of the Baroque ornamentation that cluttered the designs of American and British competitors. This was the era of the Executive Express, and the 4-eyed face became the uniform of the upwardly mobile European professional, a symbol of rational success and dynamic capability. Furthermore, the implementation of this design language introduced a fascinating hierarchy within the model range itself, most notably with the introduction of the E213 series. In a move of subtle brilliance, the number of headlights became a signifier of power. The lower-tier 4-cylinder models were equipped with single lamps, while the 6-cylinder variants were gifted the quad layout. This created a visual caste system on the streets of Europe. To see 4 lamps approaching in the mist was to know, instantly, that the machine approaching possessed superior mechanical lungs. It turned the headlight cluster into a badge of honor, a detail that car enthusiasts decoded with a glance, reinforcing the connection between cylinder count and prestige. The psychological impact of this design on the driver ahead cannot be overstated. In the lexicon of German driving culture, there is a concept known as Überholprestige, or overtaking prestige. The quad headlights were the ultimate instrument of this phenomenon. When those 4 circles of halogen light appeared in a rearview mirror, cutting through the spray of a rainy night on the A8 Autobahn, they commanded the left lane. They did not ask for permission to pass. They assumed the right of way through the sheer assertive geometry of their arrangement. It was a face that did not smile. It was the shark nose era, where the grille leaned forward and the lights sat deep in their recesses, creating a visage of kinetic urgency. As we reflect on this golden age of analog design, we see that the quad headlight evolution was far more than a trend. It was the crystallization of the BMW soul. It bridged the gap between the charming simplicity of the 60s and the technological complexities of the modern era. It established a lineage, a genetic marker that would survive the transition from round sealed beams to complex freeform reflectors, and eventually into the halo rings of the new millennium. But there, in the grain of the 1970s, amidst the tactile reality of glass, steel, and tungsten filament, the 4 eyes of the BMW defined a legacy of focused driving that remains the brand's North Star to this day. To understand the seismic shift that occurred at the turn of the millennium, one must first appreciate the stillness that preceded it. The late 1990s represented a period of complacent perfection for the Bavarian marque. The design language established under Klaus Luth had reached its zenith with the E38 7 Series and the E39 5 Series automobiles, of such handsome, understated elegance that they were widely considered the default aesthetic for the executive sedan. They were safe, evolutionary, and relentlessly logical. Yet, within the sterile, hushed boardrooms of Munich, a quiet anxiety was beginning to fester. The board of directors, looking out at a rapidly globalizing market, realized that perfection was a dead end. To simply refine the same silhouette for another decade was to invite They did not need an evolution. They required a revolution. They needed to shatter the glass display case in which they had trapped themselves. And for this task, they did not choose a conservative German hand, but rather the provocative, intellectual, and deeply polarizing vision of an American, Christopher Edward Bangle. When Chris Bangle ascended to the role of chief of design, he brought with him a philosophy that was less about automotive styling and more about deconstructivist architecture. He spoke of surfaces not as metal skins wrapped tightly around machinery, but as emotional landscapes that needed to capture light and shadow in motion. This was the birth of what would come to be known as flame surfacing, a concept that rejected the smooth, organic flowing lines of the 1990s in favor of complex, concave, and convex geometries that twisted and turned against one another. It was a violent departure from the status quo, a deliberate attempt to make the metal look as though it were being manipulated by unseen elemental forces. The studio atmosphere in Munich shifted from one of careful preservation to one of radical experimentation. Sketches were no longer refinements of the past. They were challenges to the very physics of manufacturing, demanding pressing tools and stamping technologies that did not yet exist. The first tremor of this coming earthquake was felt with the unveiling of the Z9 Gran Turismo concept in 1999. It was a harbinger, a carbon fiber prophecy of what was to come. But the true cultural detonation occurred in 2001 at the Frankfurt Motor Show, with the reveal of the E65 7 Series. To describe the atmosphere as merely shocked would be a profound understatement. The reaction was visceral, bordering on mournful. The gathered press and loyalists, expecting a speaker lower version of the beloved E38, were instead confronted with a monolithic, imposing fortress of a car. It sat high and heavy, with a brow that seemed furrowed in concentration and a rear deck the infamous bangle butt that sat atop the rear fenders like a separate architectural element. It was not a car that asked to be liked. It was a car that demanded to be seen. The sheer audacity of the design was a slap in the face to traditionalism, creating a silhouette that looked nothing like a BMW, yet possessed a presence that was undeniably commanding. The backlash was immediate and unprecedented in the history of automotive design. In an era before the total saturation of social media, the vitriol managed to organize itself with terrifying efficiency. Online petitions demanded Bangle's immediate resignation. Magazines ran covers questioning if BMW had lost its mind. The criticism was not just aesthetic, it was personal. The purists felt betrayed. Viewing the disruption of the brand's lineage as an act of vandalism against a cultural institution, they pointed to the Dame Edna headlights and the severed shutlines of the trunk as evidence of a design team that had lost its way. However, amidst the cacophony of rejection, Bangle stood firm, supported by a board that understood the long game. He argued that great design must endure a period of ugliness to push the boundary of beauty, that the polarizing nature of the car was proof of its vitality. He famously posited that in the future, all cars would look like this taller, more substantial, designed for aerodynamic efficiency in trunk space rather than mere horizontal elegance. Inside the cabin, the revolution was just as absolute and perhaps even more jarring. The driver-centric cockpit, a staple of BMW identity, where the dashboard angled intimately toward the pilot, was gone. In its place was a horizontal shelf, a minimalist expanse of wood and leather that felt more like a high-end Danish living room than a German sports sedan. The myriad of buttons that had cluttered previous interiors was swept away, replaced by a single, controversial aluminum knob, the iDrive controller. This was a fundamental rethinking of the human-machine interface, a gamble that the digital age demanded a new way to interact with complexity. While initially reviled for its learning curve and slow software, it was a prophetic move. Bangle and his team had foreseen the screen-dominated future of the automobile long before the smartphone was in every pocket, forcing the industry to confront the issue of information density in the vehicle. As the Bangle era progressed, the shock of the new began to transform into the acceptance of the norm. The design language evolved, sharpening its edges and refining its proportions with the launch of the Z4 and the E65 series. The E60, in particular, with its eagle-eye headlights that stretched back into the fenders and its slash-cut surfacing, brought the flame surfacing concept to a sporty, aggressive maturity. It looked fast while standing still, a predatory creature of light and tension. Slowly, the automotive landscape began to shift in Munich's direction. Competitors who had initially mocked the high trunk lids and complex surfaces began to quietly integrate them into their own designs. The Mercedes S-Class, the Lexus LS, and others began to adopt the aerodynamic and practical benefits of the Bangle, but validating the philosophy that form must sometimes be forced to follow a new kind of function. The vindication of the Bangle era was not found in the forums or the magazines, but in the ledger books. Despite the outcry, the E657 series became the best-selling 7 series in the company's history up to that point. The controversy had generated attention, and the attention had translated into sales from a new generation of buyers who were not beholden to the nostalgia of the 1990s. They saw the car for what it was, a modern, technologically advanced luxury product that looked like nothing else on the road. The era proved that in the luxury sector, polarization is often more profitable than anonymity. A car that everyone likes is often a car that no one loves enough to buy, but a car that creates a divide creates passion. Looking back from the vantage point of history, the Bangle era stands as the most consequential period in modern BMW design. It was the moment the company decided to stop being a curator of its own museum and chose instead to be an author of the future. The cars from this period, once reviled as ugly ducklings, have aged with a fascinating grace, their complex surfaces appearing far more contemporary today than the slab-sided competitors of the same vintage. Christopher Bangle did not just design a series of cars, he designed a shock to the system that inoculated the brand against stagnation. He proved that to maintain a legacy, one must be willing to burn it down and build something new from the ashes, leaving behind a silhouette that, love it or hate it, could never be mistaken for anything else. As the first decade of the new millennium began to wane, the global automotive landscape found itself standing upon a precipice of unprecedented uncertainty. The financial markets had shuddered to a near halt during the crisis of 2008, bringing with them a sobering re-evaluation of excess, consumption, and the very definition of luxury. Simultaneously, a rising tide of ecological consciousness was permeating the collective psyche of the consumer. The era of unapologetic displacement and consumption was rapidly drawing to a close. For a manufacturer like BMW, whose entire identity was forged in the fires of high-performance combustion engines and the visceral thrill of driving, This socio-political shift represented an existential challenge. The question posed to the designers in Munich was not merely how to update a grille or sharpen a fender, but rather how to salvage the soul of the ultimate driving machine in a world that suddenly demanded silence, sustainability, and restraint. It was in this crucible of pressure that the philosophy of efficient dynamics transformed from a mere engineering slogan into a radical, tangible design language. In the sterile, hushed corridors of the Forschungs- und Innovationszentrum, or FIZ, there was a palpable sense that the rulebook had to be discarded. Under the stewardship of Adrian Van Hoot, who was stepping out from the colossal shadow of Chris Bangle, the design team began to explore a concept that was almost paradoxical: the visual representation of efficiency. They were tasked with creating a shape that looked fast, not because it was aggressive, but because it was frictionless. The resulting aesthetic was a departure from the heavy, monolithic forms of the luxury past. Instead, the designers began to treat the air itself as a material to be molded, allowing the wind to dictate the silhouette. This was the genesis of layering, a design principle that would come to define the sub-brand BMW. It was a method of constructing the car's surface with overlapping panels, creating channels and ducts that were not hidden, but celebrated, allowing the viewer to visually trace the path of airflow through and around the vehicle. The physical manifestation of this new philosophy arrived with the shock of a thunderclap at the 2009 Frankfurt Motor Show in the form of the Vision Efficient Dynamics concept. To understand the gravity of this reveal, one must visualize the atmosphere of the hall, a sea of somber suits and conservative, evolutionary designs, suddenly interrupted by a machine that appeared to have materialized from a different century. The car was low, impossibly wide, and possessed a fluidity that defied the rigid stamping limitations of steel. It was a symphony of glass and carbon fiber reinforced plastic, materials that spoke of a new industrial age. The vehicle did not look like a car built on an assembly line. It looked like a biological entity, an exoskeleton grown around the passengers. The kidney grills were there, but they were stretched, flattened, and backed by active air flaps, glowing with a cool, electric blue hue that signaled a departure from the warm combustion of the past. Central to this narrative was the breakdown of the barrier between the exterior and the interior, a thematic dismantling of the traditional automotive fortress. In the Vision Efficient Dynamics and the production I-8 that would follow, the doors were not merely sheets of metal but complex, sculptural wings made of polycarbonate and glass. They offered transparency, literally and metaphorically, allowing the outside world to flow into the cabin. This was a deliberate philosophical statement. The driver was no longer isolating themselves from the environment in a steel box, but was participating in it, moving through the world with a lightness of footprint. The black belt design feature, a swath of dark high-gloss material running from the hood over the roof to the rear, visually reduced the height of the car, making it appear as if it were hovering just millimeters above the tarmac, tethered to the ground only by gravity and aerodynamic downforce inside the cockpit. The narrative of premium was being rewritten with a focus on sustainability that bordered on the obsessive. The designers rejected the heavy, pungent leathers and thick veneers of the traditional executive saloon. In their place, they utilized naturally tanned leathers treated with olive leaf extract, open-pore woods that felt like timber rather than plastic, and recycled textiles that possessed a tactile, technical modernity. The dashboard was no longer a wall of buttons but a floating layering of screens and surfaces, emphasizing the life-drive architecture, the separation of the passenger cell from the chassis. This interior was designed to induce a state of calm alertness, a stark contrast to the aggressive, cockpit-like interiors of the M-cars of the MT-90s. It was a space designed for the new premium consumer, one who found status in intelligence and foresight rather than brute force. The lighting design of this era played a crucial role in establishing the future efficient dynamics identity. The fierce, round xenon eyes of the previous generations evolved into the U-shaped laser light signatures, a gaze that was intense, yet distinctly digital. At the rear, the taillights became floating sculptures in their own right, acting as aerodynamic spoilers to channel air away from the flanks of the car. These lights were not just functional markers, they were the jewelry of the electric age, cool to the touch and incredibly precise. The interplay of light and shadow on the complex, layered bodywork meant that the car looked different from every angle, a shifting form that refused to be static even when parked. It captured the kinetic energy of the wind tunnel and froze it. In carbon fiber, we must also consider the auditory component of this design philosophy, for the visual and the aural are inextricably linked in the Automotive documentary. The silence of the electric motor at low speeds necessitated a design that screamed performance without making a sound. The silhouette had to promise speed, so that the lack of an idling V8 did not signal weakness. The vision-efficient dynamics and the i8 achieved this through a strategic flow, aesthetica teardrop shape tapering towards the rear that communicated velocity universally. Even the wheels were large, narrow alloys designed to slice through the air with minimal resistance, their complex spoke patterns mimicking the turbines of a jet engine, further reinforcing the aviation-inspired ethos of the vehicle. Ultimately, the future-efficient dynamics era was a brave assertion that the joy of driving Freud am Fahren could survive the transition to a carbon-constrained world. It was a rejection of the idea that an eco-friendly car must be a shapeless, penitent appliance. By synthesizing the raw emotional appeal of a sports car with the moral imperative of sustainability, BMW created a tension in the designer juxtaposition of the organic and the synthetic, the raw and the refined that remains one of the most intellectually satisfying chapters in automotive history. It was a moment where the designers looked at the approaching storm of regulation and resource scarcity, and instead of building a shelter, they built a glider to ride the wind. To understand the concept of vertical integration within the history of Bavarian motorworks, one must first step back into the grey, biting chill of Munich in the late 90s. The winter of 1959 did not merely bring frost to the windows of the Milberschiffen plant, it brought the chilling silence of impending corporate mortality. The company, a storied aviation pioneer turned automobile manufacturer, was suffering from a schizophrenic identity crisis that had bled its coffers dry. On the production floor, there was a jarring dissonance. In one corner, the ephemeral, egg-shaped Isetta bubble cars were being welded for the destitute post-war commuter, while in another, the hand-beaten aluminum panels of the glorious but commercially disastrous 507 Roadster were being shaped for a vanishing aristocracy. There was no middle ground, no structural spine to the company, and the financial sharks were circling in the murky waters of the boardroom. The air smelled not of innovation, but of liquidation. The socio-political atmosphere of West Germany at this time was one of aggressive reconstruction. The Wirtschaftswunder. Yet BMW had somehow missed the initial wave of the economic miracle. The pivotal moment arrived on December 9, 1959, at the annual general meeting, a day that historians now view as the fulcrum upon which the entire future of the brand would pivot. The proposal on the table was a humiliating acquisition by Daimler-Benz, a move that would have reduced the proud Bavarian marque to a mere supplier of truck chassis and parts. The room was thick with the smoke of cigars and the murmurs of disgruntled shareholders, a cacophony of small investors and workforce representatives who refused to let the blue and white propeller stop spinning. It was here, amidst the shouting and the desperate math of insolvency, that vertical integration ceased to be a mere manufacturing term and became a philosophy of survival. Herbert Quandt, a man whose failing eyesight seemed to grant him a paradoxically clearer vision of the future than his contemporaries, stepped into this void, against the vehement advice of his bankers, who saw only a ledger running red with losses. Quandt increased his stake in the company to nearly 50%, but his investment was not passive. It was the catalyst for a total reorganization of how a car was conceived, designed, and built. This was the true birth of BMW's vertical integration. It was the decision that design could not exist in a vacuum, separate from engineering, nor could marketing exist separate from production. The silos had to be dismantled. If the company was to survive, the path from the draftsman's table to the dealership floor had to be a single, unbroken line of logic. This new philosophy manifested physically in the development of the Neue Klasse, or New Class. For the first time, the engineers under Alexander von Falkenhausen and the designers under Wilhelm Hofmeister were not working on disparately targeted vehicles, but on a singular, focused objective, the sport sedan. Vertical integration meant that the engine block, the legendary M10 four-cylinder, was designed with the specific manufacturing capabilities of the Munich foundry in mind. It meant that the chassis dynamics were dictated by the engine's output, and the exterior skin was wrapped tightly around those mechanical truths. There was no excess, no Baroque ornamentation left over from the pre-war era. The car was to be a cohesive unit, where the turn signal stalk felt as engineered as the piston rings. As we analyze the sensory experience of the factory floor during this transition in the early 90s, we see a shift from artisan chaos to industrial ballet. The sounds changed. The erratic hammering of coach building was replaced by the rhythmic hydraulic hiss of heavy stamping presses, a heartbeat of high-pressure steel formation. Vertical integration required that BMW control its own destiny by controlling its own tooling. They could no longer rely on external coach builders to define their aesthetic. The aesthetic had to rise from the iron capability of their own machines. This profound shift meant that the famous Hofmeister kink, that sharp forward bend at the base of the C-pillar, was not just a stylistic flourish drawn on paper. It was a structural assertion, a visual reinforcement of the roofline that the new stamping dies could produce with repeatability and precision. The socio-economic landscape had also shifted to meet this new V-integrated philosophy. A new class of German professional had emerged: architects, doctors, middle managers who found the Opel too pedestrian and the Mercedes-Benz too ostentatious. They craved a machine that reflected the technical optimism of the jet age, but retained a grounded, mechanical integrity. BMW's vertical integration allowed them to pivot rapidly to meet this demographic, because the design and engineering teams were now intertwined. Feedback from the road could be implemented into production changes with unprecedented speed. The car became a living document of the company's internal dialogue, a dialogue that was no longer an argument, but a harmonious agreement. It is crucial to recognize that this era established the driver-centric ethos that would define the brand for the next half-century. Vertical integration meant that the interior ergonomics, the angle of the dashboard, the resistance of the gear lever, the clarity of the analog dials were treated with the same reverence as the suspension geometry. Paul G. Honneman, the sales director, who would later be known as Niche Paul, understood that to sell this new philosophy, the marketing had to be an extension of the engineering. You were not buying a car, you were buying into a holistic system of Bavarian competence. The advertisements became cleaner, more factual, mirroring the honest lines of the 1500 and 1800 sedans. In retrospect, the vertical integration of the early 1960s was an act of intense discipline. It required saying no to the distracting allure of supercars or budget microcars to focus entirely on the executive middle ground. It was a gamble that relied on the belief that a customer could feel the difference between a car assembled from parts and a car birthed from a unified vision. As the first new E-Class sedans rolled out of the factory gates and onto the Autobahn, the exhaust note was different: crisp, raspy, and eager. It was the sound of a company that had looked into the abyss of bankruptcy and found, in the darkness, the resolve to integrate every atom of its being into a singular driving purpose. The silence of the 1959 crisis had been broken, replaced by the hum of a perfectly balanced driveshaft, spinning towards a horizon that was finally, and undeniably, clear. To understand the gravity of the Vision New E-Class, one must first traverse the murky, turbulent waters of the late 1950s, a period where the Bayerisch Motoren work stood precariously upon the precipice of absolute ruin. It was a time of disjointed identity, where the company's portfolio oscillated wildly between the diminutive, bubble-like Isetta and the opulent, Baroque grandeur of the 501 Baroque Angel, leaving a hollow, aching void in the middle market where solvency truly lived. The original New E-Class, the new class of 1961, was not merely a sedan. It was a desperate, calculated gasp for air, a lifeline financed by the industrialist Herbert Quanti, designed to fend off a hostile acquisition by Daimler-Benz. When we look at the Vision New E-Class of the modern era, revealed in the hushed, sterile sanctity of the 21st century, we are not looking at a mere concept car. We are witnessing a cyclical resonance, a deliberate and ghostly echo of that initial moment of survival, reinterpreted for a world standing on the brink of a different kind of revolution, the silent, inevitable shift to electrification and digitalization. As the camera pans across the surface of the Vision New E-Class, the viewer is immediately struck by a profound sense of visual silence, a reductionist philosophy that borders on the in an era where automotive design has become increasingly frenetic, characterized by aggressive vents, jagged character lines, and an overabundance of chromatic jewelry. This vessel engages in a radical act of refusal. It rejects the noise. The bodywork is a singular, fluid sculpture, painted in a luminous shade that seems to hold the light rather than reflect it. Affectionately dubbed Joyous Bright, it captures the ethos of a society overwhelmed by data and sensory input, offering instead a mobile sanctuary of clarity. The expansive surfaces are uninterrupted, clean, and vast, recalling the mid-century modernist architecture of Mies van der Rohe or the product design of Dieter Rams. It is a return to the essential, suggesting that the ultimate luxury in a complicated world is not addition, but subtraction. The front fascia of the vehicle presents a fascinating metamorphosis of the brand's most sacred icon, the kidney grille. For nearly a century, these dual intakes were functional lungs, gasping for oxygen to feed the combustion chambers of inline-6 and V8 engines. Here, in the electric silence of the vision, the lungs have become eyes. The grille spans the entire width of the car, integrating the headlights into a single digital canvas that pulsates with a rhythmic, ethereal glow. This is no longer a machine that breathes air. It is a machine that breathes light. It acknowledges the history of the Sharknose, proud that aggressive, forward-leaning stance that defined the 2002 and the E9 coupes, but softens it, rendering it approachable, almost human. The car engages in a form of digital pareidolia, mimicking facial expressions to greet the driver, blurring the harsh line between cold industrial machinery and a sentient companion. Transitioning to the interior, we step across a threshold that separates the mechanical past from the digital future, yet the atmosphere is surprisingly warm, bathed in the glow of a corduroy-like yellow fabric that feels distinctly vintage. The cabin eschews the cold, dark leathers and carbon fibers that have dominated the Teutonic idea of sportiness for decades. Instead, it embraces the concept of the gemütlich living space, a bright, airy lounge designed not just for transport, but for being. The sunlight pours in through an expansive glass roof, illuminating a dashboard that has been stripped of almost all physical switchgear. There are no chrome bezels, no piano black plastics collecting fingerprints, and no cluttered array of buttons. The interface is projected, a panoramic vision that sweeps across the bottom of the windshield, placing information directly into the driver's line of sight without demanding their focus. It is a philosophy of eyes on the road, hands on the wheel, re-engineered for a generation raised on touchscreens and augmented reality. We must also consider the socio-political undercurrents that this vehicle navigates. Just as the 1960s Neue Klasse was a response to the economic reconstruction of post-war Germany, the Vision Neue Klasse is a response to the environmental and technological mandates of the Anthropocene. It represents a pivot away from the raw, mechanical dominance of the 20th century, the smell of gasoline, the roar of the exhaust, the intricate dance of pistons and valves toward a circular economy. The materials are recycled and recyclable. The chrome has been banished not just for aesthetics, but because the plating process is environmentally taxing. This car is an admission that the definition of premium has shifted. Status is no longer conveyed through excess consumption or displacement, but through sustainability, digital intelligence, and a conscientious footprint. It is a diplomatic envoy from the future, assuring the enthusiast that the soul of driving can survive the death of the combustion engine. Yet, amidst this futurism, the designers have carefully preserved the Hofmeister kink, that subtle, counterintuitive curve at the base of the seat. First introduced by Wilhelm Hofmeister in 1961, this design element was originally intended to suggest that the car was rear-wheel drive, visually pushing the weight onto the back axle. On the Vision Neue Klasse, this kink remains etched into the glass and bodywork with reverence. It serves as an anchor, a genetic marker ensuring that despite the electric powertrain and the autonomous capabilities, the lineage remains unbroken. It is a whisper to the cognoscenti, a reassurance that while the method of propulsion has changed, the driving dynamics, the sheer joy of movement, remain the central tenet of the mark. It proves that heritage is not about worshipping ashes, but about passing on the fire. The interplay of light and shadow on the car's flanks reveals the monolithic approach to surfacing. There are no door handles to break the slipstream. The mirrors are replaced by cameras that slice through the wind with minimal resistance. This aerodynamic purity is necessitated by the physics of electrification, where every count of drag coefficient robs the battery of range. However, BMW has turned this engineering constraint into an aesthetic virtue. The car looks as though it was eroded by the wind itself, smoothed over time like a river stone. It possesses a heavy, planted stance, with wheels pushed to the absolute corners of the chassis, maximizing the interior volume and promising the stability for which the brand is renowned. The wheel arches are muscular but integrated, avoiding the tact and aggression of current performance SUVs in favor of a confident, inherent strength. Ultimately, the Vision Neue class is a manifesto written in sheet metal and code. It stands as a bridge between the analog romance of the 20th century and the digital seamlessness of the 21st. It asks us to reconsider our relationship with the automobile, to view it not as a tool of conquest or a symbol of raw power, but as a partner in a complex, interconnected world. As the scene fades, leaving only the soft pulsation of the car's digital heartbeat, we are left with the realization that BMW is not merely launching a new model line. They are attempting to do exactly what they did in the early 1960s, redefine the very parameters of their existence, betting the farm on a vision of clarity, light, and human-centric technology. It is a calm, quiet, yet monumental declaration that the future, while different, will still be driven.